If you are at all like me and are chronically online, you've most likely saw comm girls, or at least comm girl makeup. But a lot of people know this term but don't actually know where it came from. And in saying that, you have probably also heard of 764. It has been all over the news, on FBI warnings, on TikTok. Even I've spoken about it in some of my videos. And there are links to grooming and extortion and psychological swatting and harassment campaigns. But what isn't so widely known is that 764 doesn't act in isolation, and behind all of that there is a much larger network called the Comm, which is short for the community, and it was primarily associated with swim swapping circles rather than extortion networks. And the use of Comm as a collective label for these extortion focused groups appears to have emerged a lot later than these groups did, and became increasingly popular around 2021. And a lot of the individuals in these spaces that have described themselves as old Comm would not have used the term prior to 2022. But Comm exists as a decentralised online ecosystem made up of overlapping groups and cybercriminals, extortion networks, extremist subcultures, and online sadist communities that consistently evolve across platforms like Discord and Telegram, Roblox, Instagram, and so many more. And the more you look into it, the more disturbing it gets. This video will be discussing pretty triggering topics. You will be able to find a full list in the description, but please keep that in mind. Please look at the trigger warnings, and please don't watch this video if you feel that it might affect you in any way. I will also leave some help links in the description if you feel like you have been affected by anything we've spoken about today. Before we go any further, I do want to give a huge thank you to our channel members who allow me to keep spreading awareness and talking about these subjects. As we know, YouTube tends to demonetize these videos, so in being a channel member, it means that you directly help me to keep being able to spread awareness on these topics as I'm studying, and it is so greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. An insider from Comm describes the space in a Telegram post as a network of different child extortion rings. Sigma enthusiast and many of his good friends such as Island Monkey, Kush, MK Ultra, Kenvy, Gore Butcher, Connor, Brad, Rex Mensis, Riley764, Caleb Merritt, Lalo, and many others have all been active participants in Comm affiliated groups such as 764, Cult, Legion, Anarchy, Temple of Blood, D-Resistance, Scums, and 6996. There are others, but those are at this point the main ones. Not only do people who are part of Comm affiliated groups like to minors, mostly teenage girls, but in some cases also teenage boys, but they also like to extort these minors and make themselves, often severely. Some, such as Caleb Merritt, have even went as far as doing these things outside of the internet in addition to on the internet. Many of the teenagers themselves, which does not excuse their behaviour because they are the sorts of things that are unacceptable regardless of how old the victims and perpetrators are. Teenage groups will often bring other teenagers into these groups. And what makes Comm difficult to understand is that it's not one singular group, as was just said. It's an overlapping ecosystem of online criminal networks that have existed long before most people had even heard of 764. And for a long time, cybersecurity researchers in the InfoSec community were already aware of these networks due to their involvement in SIM swapping, swatting, cryptocurrency theft, corporate intrusions, and various other forms of cybercrime. Though Discord and Telegram are usually the platforms most associated with modern day extortion communities, the culture itself predates both, and many of the practices now associated with groups like 764 can be traced back to older online spaces, particularly image boards and blackmail communities that existed long before these groups became widely known. And one platform that appears repeatedly throughout these discussions of early extortion culture is, of course, 4chan, particularly the sock board. While it was originally intended as a place for users to socialise and share contact information and meet new people, it also became a recruitment ground for a variety of exploitative communities. Users would advertise group chats, recruit members, and direct people towards private servers where blackmail, extortion, and sharing of illegal material could take place away from the public view of these boards. And blackmail communities were already operating on 4chan years before groups like 764 emerged, and there's discussions referencing blackmail coercion that can be found dating back to at least the mid-2010s, meaning that a lot of the tactics which are later used by these groups weren't new, and instead these newer communities inherited and adapted these practices that already existed. But earlier groups moved between image boards, Skype, Kik, TeamSpeak, Discord, Telegram, and various other services depending on which platform offered the least resistance to moderation and enforcement. And rather than just taking a step back and disappearing when these platforms would be removed, they would just regroup elsewhere and continue operating. But the Comm is well known to law enforcement all around the world. In July, the FBI issued a public warning about the Comm, describing it as a primarily English-speaking international online ecosystem comprised of multiple interconnected networks whose members, many of whom are minors, engage in a variety of criminal violations. And the UK's National Crime Agency has said reports of Comm networks have increased sixfold in the UK from 2022 to 2024. The NSA describes Comm members as usually young men who are motivated by status, power, control, misogyny, gratification, or an obsession with extreme or violent material. In 2021, law enforcement agencies of the US, UK, Germany, Romania, and Brazil launched investigations on about a dozen individuals linked to the Comm. In the US, several people were federally charged, and in September 2023, the FBI issued warnings about the network as part of their investigation into 764. In July and October 2024, multiple suspects affiliated with the Comm committed 6 assaults on random bystanders in Sweden, and on January 30th, 2025, police in the US arrested 2 people, aged 23 and 41, as part of a joint Interpol-Europol crackdown on the Comm. Those men were members of Clout, which predates 764, and is a violent Nazi affiliate of the Comm that coerced 16 minors into sending them of themselves and committing sex. And in August last year, it was reported that children on Roblox were being lured into joining a cult called Spawnism, which is based around an in-game symbol. Victims were reported as carrying the symbol onto their skin in the belief that it would allow them to respawn after death, like a video game character. Within Comm, there isn't structured organisation with clear membership. It's more like a consistently shifting web of overlapping networks and subcultures and criminal ecosystems, which are connected through this weird internet culture of gaming and extremist ideology. And people move between these spaces constantly. It's not set in stone. Someone involved in a spawning community might not directly participate in child exploitation networks, but they might still provide doxing or spawning services that are later used in extortion campaigns against minors. Some networks which are connected to 764 have begun encouraging minors to escalate from online abuse and cybercrime into real-world violence, influenced by extremist groups and certain occult ideologies tied to organisations like Order of Nine Angles and other violent subcultures. And as we know, a significant portion of these networks operate through community platforms like Roblox and Minecraft, platforms which have an overwhelming amount of young player bases, often consisting of children from the ages of 8 to 13. And these platforms have become a recruitment network for Comm. And it's not because the games on Roblox or Minecraft are inherently malicious or, things like that. Although there have been cases where people have found games that are very questionable to be on there. But it's that it gives direct access to minors. And this is more specifically on games like Dollhouse Roleplay or The Hood, various other ones, but they're primarily the most popular ones. One viewer who reached out to me via email said that they didn't go looking for these communities at all. And according to them, people in these spaces will deliberately target vulnerable teenagers from mental health servers, TikTok, and other communities where they know they'll find isolated young people. And in most cases, these young people do suffer from mental health issues. And a lot of the time, it's because of a poor household environment. And due to that poor household environment, it drives the child to feel isolated and neglected. And so Comm can be described as a sort of teenage utopia, where people typically ranging from the ages of 13 to 19 go to seek asylum from that and escape their real life environment, however that might be. The odds are the victim suffers from mental illness rooted in internalized neglect, influenced by their parents or other environmental factors. Members of networks associated with the Comm target these spaces to identify isolated or vulnerable children before gradually moving them into spaces like Discord or Telegram, where grooming, manipulation, and exploitation can begin. And incentives like free Robux or Discord Nitro are frequently used as bait to lure minors into these private communities, which are controlled by predators. And in some cases, the invitation links themselves contain IP loggers or other malicious files which are designed to collect personal information from the victim's devices. And as we know, within the spaces, doxing and social engineering and leaking of personal information are very, very common. And entire archives and databases exist containing real and sometimes false personal information about victims and rival users of other networks. And for a lot of minors who aren't familiar with digital security, it creates a lot of fear. I actually done this with my friends the other day, where I sent in a link to a TikTok. The link I'd sent in was an IP grabber, in which when they clicked it, I could see their IP, their information, their device information. They had no idea. It's very, very hard, unless you're tech savvy, to know what to look out for. And it is so easy to fall victim to this. So group that with minors. There are many, many cases, which I'll get into later, which involve coercion, threats of swatting, harassment, and intimidation, which are used to manipulate these minors into compliance. And for some private servers, they allegedly require users to prove themselves before entering. And that can be through sharing exploitative material, evidence of harm, or participation in extreme behaviour. But one name that comes up very frequently in discussions about these communities is Rabid764, who is associated with a Discord server known as Sewer.
You are my little kitten. You're my little kitten, and you better watch. I'll extort you, and I'll make you be cutting my in your forehead.
The same viewer who emailed me described joining this server and immediately being exposed to graphic imagery. They said one of the first things that they saw was a young girl with a username body. They told me that they first encountered the material through the server which was linked to 764. And they also described something that was incredibly common in these spaces.
I might have people like themselves with a cable or their pets or just do what, and I record it, or have other people record it, and then like I'm part of a cult, like a really bad people cult, but I'm also part of some other who just make
and they explained that shortly after joining, they were reconnected with someone who had previously manipulated them when they were younger. And even years later, they say that they still receive unwanted messages from people connecting to these communities. And they will never have a public account because they're afraid of being recognised. And that's something that I'm very familiar with. And the major thing about the Comm in these networks is that even if you distance yourself, and even if you leave, for a lot of former members, that experience follows you throughout your life, and it doesn't matter if you change your username, or the servers are gone, or the community's moved to other platforms, but that terror and fear stays with you. And when you talk about the harm that are caused by these spaces, it's not just the physical harm that happens in the moment, but it's that long-lasting trauma that stays with you your entire life and directly impacts everything you do and the way you move in your day-to-day. And in saying that, over time these environments can normalize extremely shocking content to these minors who might not fully understand the legal repercussions or the psychological consequences of what they're actively participating in. The majority of people in these spaces are minors themselves. Some of them feel like they're immune to legal consequences because of their age, but there has been a lot of recent arrests associated with 764 and the Comm, alongside a rapidly growing law enforcement attention, which have begun creating panic within these parts of the communities as they're starting to realise that their consequences have actions. But the Comm network has another important currency to it that's not just Roblox or Nitro, and that's Clout. Leaders and influencers in these networks regularly state, both in chats and in court documents, Clout and power were central to their participation in these criminal activities. Due to that central control of Clout within these spaces, it's not really surprising that access to vanity tags or in-game cosmetics plays a pretty vital role for those who are not only seeking to recruit victims, but are avid gamers and are already in these communities. Part of how they attract minors in the first place is by having access to these in-game items and all the vanity items that they have on the server. And it's also why they give themselves titles and access across all the chats and channels. And these tags are a way for users to demonstrate their power and influence in the network. And so those that don't have those items or tags are ranked lower within the hierarchy of the network. But almost every news report that is about Comm or 764 and other groups in the network describe them as satanic. But it's kind of more complicated than that. And while there have been connections made between some members and groups like O9A, the connections are pretty exaggerated, and in many cases this O9 imagery and references and symbolism have been adopted just because they're viewed as extreme and controversial and intimidating, not necessarily that they believe this ideology. Part of that connection comes from the influence of groups like the Atomwolf Division, which incorporated elements of O9A into its worldview and attracted individuals which are interested in violent and transgressive ideas. Some people involved in the communities start adopting similar aesthetics, and that's why figures such as Caleb Merritt used usernames which reference O9A and participated in circles connected to the ideology. But other members, like those connected to 764, purely use it for the shock factor, because it's edgy and dangerous, not because they actually think, oh, satanic, I believe in this. But although O9A still has connections to some individuals within extortion communities, its influence isn't as strong or widespread as it used to be. Many of the people involved in these communities come from ordinary or pretty disadvantaged backgrounds, yet this sort of online status is tied to wealth and influence and success and clout, and they're higher up in this hierarchy. And as a result, a lot of the people in them exaggerate or completely lie about aspects of their life to appear more powerful than they really are. Going back a bit, Comm can be broken down into three main pillars. Extortion Comm, where 764 and the likes is located, and where there are currently 250 active FBI investigations into this branch of Comm alone. Cybercomm and offline comm. Comm and 764 have been growing particularly over the past 2 years. Currently, there are approximately 12,000 unique accounts across 78 extortion comm Telegram groups. Beyond these, there are 303 additional groups in the wider comm network. In reality, this is an underestimation of the size of membership groups across the network. And to give a little sense of scale, a speaker for the National Centre of Missing and Exploited Children showed some pretty alarming statistics about the reports they have received linked to 764. In 2023, there were 260 tips sent to NCMEC. In 2024, there have been 1,100 tips sent in, which is a 423 increase. The majority of tips which NCMC receive come from platforms and law enforcement themselves, but more than 50% of the tips linked to 764 have been reported by victims, family members, and friends, meaning that law enforcement are very underrepresented within these cases, and they're not catching them before the victims or the family members feel that they have to report it. But to understand how Comm grew so quickly, it's important to look at everything that came before it. And Brad 764 didn't just create 764 out of nowhere. Before that, he became involved with a Discord group called Clout, which already had a reputation for extortion, child exploitation, and various other forms of abusive behaviour. Brad became fascinated with the group, comparing it to the kind of dark web horror stories and red room myths that was circulated online for years. And through Cult, he met people from other communities and started building the connections that would later help 764 expand. And as we know, these groups existed long before Discord and Telegram and operated through the likes of 4chan. And one person who appears repeatedly throughout this period is Zachary Dosh, better known online as Moist Nigerian. And Dosh introduced Brad to extortion and played a pretty vital role in shaping some of the tactics that would later become common within 764. Dosh was already active in extortion circles and had connections to a number of online communities before eventually being arrested on child exploitation charges. His involvement is always brought up to show just how interconnected these groups are. And as 764 grew, members started building recruitment systems designed to bring more people into the network. One of the first steps was creating Telegram chats as a backup in case Discord servers were removed. And different groups would partner with one another, shared members, and directed users between each server, which allowed the community to grow far beyond one single Discord group. And by the time 764 had even started appearing on the news, many of the relationships that helped it grow had already existed for months and years before that. But within these communities, lore books are often treated as a record of a person's entire online history. And a lore book can contain screenshots, chat logs, photographs, allegations, personal information, archive posts, and anything else that is deemed relevant to an individual. Sometimes the documents are created around pretty prominent figures in the community, documenting their actions, their rivalries they have, and their involvement with different groups. But in other cases, they're created around victims. And when that happens, that creates so much more power over these minors and victims, as everything that they have done online is within these lore books. And they can even fabricate things that aren't even necessarily true, and that's how we see a lot of these comm girls get cancelled online, because they were coerced and extorted into doing these horrible acts, and it's all kept record of, so if they ever step out of line, they can get cancelled. And status within these communities is heavily dependent on content, which is the frequency, extremity, and quality of the material which is produced. And the more extreme the content, the higher the perceived value and influence of the individual producing it. And this is very akin to the likes of horror, hurt to the core that we see on the dark web within these circles, as you can only be allowed access into certain groups if you produce extremely violent material. And in many cases, the harm inflicted is framed as being for the lols, for administrative privileges within servers, for special roles or titles, or for inclusion on internal rosters. In other cases, it's done for access to more restricted or premium communities. But these rewards are temporary. Titles can be removed, your access can be revoked, and that means that these internal hierarchies are constantly shifting and changing. But going back to rosters, on bare bones, a roster is just a list of usernames connected to a particular group. But being included on a roster can be seen as recognition, proof of your group membership, and evidence that someone has earned a place within that community. And within the Comm network, people compete to get added to rosters, they argue over who belongs in them, and sometimes even claim affiliations they don't actually have in order to appear more important within these communities. and ownership of a group can be transferred between users. And as a result, arguments over who controls what group, or who has the right to represent it, or whether a roster is legitimate are very common. But that can lead to outside extremism, where members seeking recognition will do that through extremely violent acts. And the more shocking the content, the more attention it brings. And it creates a cycle which it just escalates and escalates as a way to gain status within a community. Alongside Comm, there's an ecosystem which is often referred to as anti-extortion Comm, or AECOM. And these groups present themselves as opposing extortion networks and exposing people who are involved in exploitation. Many of them include former members who claim to have left Comm and now position themselves as investigators or vigilantes. A lot of the AA species have been linked to networks like No Lives Matter, which is just another form of violent extremism. But the main thing that separates Comm from traditional extremist movements is that in more sort of conventional extremist groups, loyalty to the group often provides some level of safety and protection or solidarity within the groups. But within Comm, that's not the case at all. In fact, it's the complete opposite. Members can become victims just as easily as outsiders can. That harm is directed both into the group and outwards. And so people gain attention through this harmful behaviour, and that behaviour increases their status, and that status just further encourages escalation. And so the consequences of that isn't just about their clout and their drama, but that creates a lot of harm that affects victims both online and outline. Within these spaces, is frequently documented and circulated as a form of proof or loyalty or some form of currency. And two recurring forms of content frequently referred within these communities are fan signs and signs. Fan signs involve a victim displaying the name of an individual or group written on a physical surface, like their body, paper, walls, or other objects. Signs is when a name or a phrase is directly into the skin. People in these communities share images or videos of injuries to gain acceptance or status. Eating disorders are also actively encouraged and exploited, with participants pressured to demonstrate extreme weight loss or restriction behaviours. And discussions of suicide and substance are very, very common, and they are very, very normalised in these communities. Animal also highly reported and is sometimes used again as a form of initiation or proof of commitment to these groups. And one of the most well-known incidents discussed within these communities involves a victim known as Holy Girl 222, and she was allegedly coerced her cat by an extortionist associated with the Cascar network. After the incident, she became the target of further harassment, including doxing and swatting. Discussions about the case often became focused on the victim rather than the people that were coercing her to do it, and other people tried to frame her as a willing participant within this, as if she wanted to do that. But members are also associated with a wide range of criminal acts, which include violence, arson, property damage, which are often carried out, as we know, for status, not for their ideological purpose, like 09A. Swatting is used.
Alright, so can I report child? So there's this messaging app where you can message people. It's called Discord.
But one of the most extreme examples is Nino Luciano, also known online as Tobe764, Hardcore, or Necrohunt. Luciano was reportedly involved with groups including 764, 6996, and MKU, but is most known for the murder of a 74-year-old woman in Romania and the attempt to another person. In April 2022, when he was 17 years old, Luciano attacked a 74-year-old woman in Romania. The attack was streamed in a Discord call, and he was arrested shortly afterwards and convicted of aggravated attempted destruction and child offences and received a 14-year prison sentence, which, in my opinion, is far from enough. But I think it's worth looking into some of the documents that circulate between these members, and they're not really like manifestos or anything like that. They're more like instruction manuals. Some of the most frequently referenced include the Extortion Handbook, Suicide Guide 2.0, the 6996 Bible, Purgatory, and the Docs Guide. And although they focus on different things, they all revolve around the same core idea of turning vulnerability into something which can be exploited. The Extortion Handbook, which has been linked to a 764 affiliated individual known as a convict, it's like a step-by-step guide on manipulation. It explains how to identify vulnerable people online, build trust with them, gain access to personal or explicit material, and then use that material for blackmail. The document talks about creating fake personas, mirroring a victim's interests, and using flattery or emotional support to lower their guard before gradually escalating into coercion. It also covers ways of avoiding detection, including anonymous accounts, VPNs, and other methods which are designed to separate online activity from a person's real identity. And in some cases, the victims are pressured for money. In others, it's the material is traded or shared within the community, making it its own form of currency. The Guide 2.0 takes a very different approach, and rather than focusing on manipulating other people, it presents self-destruction in a very cold, procedural way, and it discusses harm and final messages, which are treated more like a series of steps for someone to follow. This material has been sometimes shared with vulnerable individuals during live interactions, which have escalated their already dangerous situation. The Docs Guide focuses on gathering personal information and using that as leverage over a victim, and it outlines how to collect information and use exposure and intimidation and harassment over these individuals to control them. The 6996 Bible uses discussions of tracking links, data collection, frauds, and also covers recruitment, group control, and methods of maintaining loyalty within these groups. The document itself encourages secrecy, internal hierarchy, and consistent escalation. But Purgatory stands apart from the others because it leans more into that heavy extremist ideology, which isn't really present in a lot of the groups. It's more for aesthetic purposes. And it promotes white supremacist beliefs, decentralized organization, and violence and propaganda and intimidation as a way to participate. But these documents are all written as a way to teach people how to do things. Manipulation, harassment, exploitation, intimidation, and violence are all tools within these handbooks. But it also sort of helps to explain why ideology isn't really an attraction to these people, and it's more so a sense of belonging and visibility within these communities. Ideology can come later, but it comes as a way to justify individual behaviour. But going right back to the start, Comm girls. The thing that I think makes these communities so difficult to understand is that they don't look the way you would expect them to look. When most people think of these like online extremist groups, you think of O9A and that sort of dark, satanic, violent symbolism. But it's really not what it looks like, and that's the scariest part to me, I think. And one of the most common aesthetics used is cutecore. Profiles are filled with pastel colours, plush toys, anime, cute bedroom pictures, and you probably saw a lot of this content on TikTok. But cutecore very often overlaps with communities sort of content and unhealthy relationships. But at the very same time, there's a very noticeable gender divide here, as male users will often adopt these darker aesthetics which are violent and occult imagery and shock value, but a lot of the female users are more likely to present through softer cutecore or e-girl aesthetics. A lot of these people meet in a very seemingly normal way through Discord servers, TikTok, Instagram, Roblox, or mutual connections. Friendships can quickly develop and emotional support becomes pretty central to those relationships. And for young people who already feel extremely isolated, it can create a very strong sense of belonging. But over time, this affection, validation, and these gifts that are given can be used as tools for manipulation. And these requests can become more personal and your boundaries can shift. A lot of the time it turns into coercion. In some cases it involves content, or encouragement, exploitation, or pressure to prove their loyalty through very extreme measures. But what makes cutecore so concerning is that the warning signs aren't obvious. The aesthetic isn't inherently harmful in any way, and a lot of people enjoy pastels and anime and fashion and coquette without having any connection to these communities. But the issue is how the aesthetics can sometimes be used within comm-like spaces to create trust and make harmful behaviour seem so much more normal. And that's why a lot of people who research into the comm and former members themselves describe these aesthetics as a gateway, not a cause. And as we know, people rarely join these communities because of their ideology. They're drawn in through friendship and identity and belonging and these shared interests. And the aesthetics make these spaces feel a lot more familiar and safer and welcoming, and the more harmful aspects are introduced gradually. In saying that though, cutecore also exists alongside other aesthetics found within the network, like cute gorecore, devilcore. They're oftentimes a lot more overt in their themes of violence or cult, but they all serve the same main purpose of creating identities and communities that revolve around visibility, belonging, and that increasingly extremely violent behaviour. And a lot of these cutecore girls on TikTok are used as a way of identifying vulnerable people because of the content they post or their shared interests. And it introduces them to communities where this harmful behaviour is so normalised. And that's why it's important to recognise these aesthetics within the communities. As we said, it's not a cause, but it's a gateway. No one joins these communities because they truly want to. but they want to belong and they want to feel a sense of identity and belonging outside of the traumatic lives that they may be experiencing elsewhere, but it only leads to a cycle of trauma. That is all for today. This was very, very hard to research. Thank you so much for those of you who reached out to me and shared your experiences. It is very greatly appreciated, and I just want to say again how brave you are for doing that. Trust me when I say I know it is not easy to talk about these things. It is so hard to put yourself out there and speak about your experiences, but by not speaking about it, this is how we let it continue to happen. So thank you so much for reaching out to me. I hope you're all doing okay. I know that was a lot. Please take care of yourself. That was not easy to listen to. It was not easy to say. But like I said, not speaking about it lets it continue to happen, and it shouldn't happen. Do I need to say that? I don't think I need to say that. But let me know your thoughts. If you have any more information, please, please, please let me know. It is so hard to get information unless you're in these communities, and I am not doing that to myself. I'm not doing that. But there was a really good researcher, actually. I'll put all my links and stuff in the description. There's one researcher who has done a lot of work into this, and I'm very grateful for that. But I'll leave that in the description. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. How are you doing? And I will see you next time. Bye.